In this video, I'm going to be talking about how I prepped for my Google coding interviews and landed an offer as an L3 software engineer. An L3 software engineer is an entry-level position in the Google software engineering ladder. My goal in this video is to give you insight into the Google hiring process, the nature of tech interviews, and 5 tips for helping you prepare for your Google coding interview so that you can develop mastery and confidence going into your next technical interview. Okay, let's dive in. First, I want to talk a bit about the Google hiring process. Like any other company, there are 2 fundamental stages to this process: getting an interview and doing well in the interview. Getting an interview happens in one of 3 ways. You apply through the front door, you're recruited by a recruiter, or you have an internal referral. And there's a lot to say on each of these topics, so I'll save all of these for a different video. The question that I want to address today is how to do well in an interview. Now, before I dive in, I need to explain that there are several different interview formats that you can expect from your Google interview process: a coding question interview, a behavioral interview, and a system design interview. The Google hiring process typically looks something like having a recruiter phone screen, and then a technical phone screen, and then a full day of on-site interviews. Now, these days, both the technical phone screen and the on-site interviews are all done virtually over Google Meet. Depending on your current experience, you can expect different amounts of these interviews in your interview process. Generally speaking, the longer you've worked in industry as a professional software engineer already, you're going to see more system design questions and less coding interview questions. For example, as of mid-2022 when I left Google, here's what you can expect for the L3 and L4 positions. L3 interviews, typically reserved for people with 0 to 2 years of professional experience, would have 1 behavioral interview and 4 coding question interviews. And L4 interviews, typically reserved for people with 2 to 4 years of professional experience, would have 1 behavioral interview, 1 system design interview, and 3 coding question interviews. Now, the rest of this video will be about preparing for the Google coding question interview, so it'll be most relevant for people with 0 to maybe up to 3 to 4 years of professional experience. So in order to map out a sane strategy for interview prep, we have to first understand the interview format and structure. It's important to reverse engineer the outcome that the hiring manager is looking for so that we can work backwards and cater our preparation to achieve the desired outcome. Now, a typical Google coding interview will start out in one of several ways. For example, you might get a really ambiguous problem statement like diff2 lists, implement collision detection, or find the union between 2 different sets. Or you might get a more specific problem statement that looks something like given an array of numbers, or basically anything that looks like a leet code type question. Now, if you've never heard of leet code, I'm going to touch on this just a little bit later in the video, so just keep watching. Regardless of how ambiguous the problem statement is, as a candidate, your first job is going to be to understand it and then to identify the constraints to the problem. Then you'll want to come up with different solutions. And finally, implement the best one that you can in a shared code editing environment. Now, you won't be able to execute the code, so it's important that you verify your work by pretending to be the interpreter, going line by line and testing your code. So that's the interview format in a nutshell. Next, I want to touch on why Google coding interviews are the way that they are. Having been on the other side of the interview process as an interviewer, here's why I think they do things the way they do. Coding problem interviews are an imperfect proxy to see how you're able to do a few key things, like navigate ambiguity, orient yourself in the underlying context of a problem, balance trade-offs between solutions, choose judiciously, and justify your reasoning, all while actually being able to code and communicate effectively with a team. This is very difficult to parse out in a 45-minute interview. So a coding problem interview is a bit of a ceremonial dance to hypothetically tease out some of these signals. For example, people who communicate what they're doing line by line as they write it out will generally be rated higher on the communication front. But that's hardly indicative of whether they're actually nice, easy to work with, and can work well in your team. This is what I mean by a ceremonial dance. This dance that you have to put on is pretty well documented if you go searching for coding interview advice. Silliness aside, it's important that you prepare for the coding interviews with this following blueprint. 1. Navigate ambiguous problem requirements. 2. Understand the nature of the problem. 3. Propose different solutions and discuss their trade-offs. 4. Choose an approach and justify your reasoning. 5. Communicate how you will implement it. 6. Implement the algorithm and communicate while you implement it so that the interviewer knows what you're thinking. 7. Finally, test your code line by line by pretending to be the interpreter and writing out the program state as necessary so that your interviewer can follow along with your logic. And being able to reliably do this is going to come with practice. Here are 5 things that I did to prepare along with the resources that I used. Thing number 1 that I did was to set aside an amount of time to practice every single day. When I look back at my own interview prep experience, I would say that the commitment to practice each day was the single biggest reason why I succeeded. I personally did 90 minutes of focus time every day, but I think you can get away with 60 minutes. However, any less and you're probably going to start running out of time to really dive deep and sink your teeth into a specific problem. And for those of you who have other commitments, like maybe you have kids or just other things in life, I get it. This is a big ask. It can be quite jarring to try to make a new commitment like this. You'll need to shift your priorities. You'll have to move some things around. There will be some resistance in getting this commitment up and running. But if you have the desire to work at a big tech company, then this preparation is going to be key to make sure that you do well in the interview. Be sure you start with this commitment because the other advice in the rest of this video is not very useful if you aren't practicing. So the second thing that I did was to come up with a problem roadmap strategy. My go-to resource for interview prep is LeetCode. LeetCode is basically a giant repository of interview questions. They even have editorial solutions for some problems where they discuss the trade-offs between different approaches. Now, LeetCode has a random question button that picks one out of the repository for you, but I wouldn't recommend starting there. At the beginning, you actually want to follow a logical order of data structures and algorithms to study. Here's why. Some algorithms build on top of other algorithms. For example, graph traversal builds on tree traversal, and tree traversal uses a fundamental data structure called queues. This means that you should study in the order of queues, then trees, then graphs, for example. NeetCode with an N is a great YouTube channel that breaks down this methodical approach to data structures and algorithms. I highly recommend checking out his stuff. Now you can mostly Google around for the conceptual stuff, like the mechanics of each data structure and algorithm. But I personally resorted to using a book called Cracking the Coding Interview. Most of the information in that book is available online through various articles and courses, so it's definitely not a necessary purchase. However, the book is nicely laid out in a series of chapters where each chapter is dedicated to a specific data structure. The chapters are also ordered in a way that follows this advice, so I think it's a worthwhile investment. Now, LeetCode also has a filtering mechanism so you can target your practice at specific data structures and algorithms. This makes it possible to focus all of your effort in understanding one topic at a time. This is going to be important. So the third thing that I did was to emphasize understanding over completion. A big mistake people make when practicing interview problems is that they just don't dive deep enough to understand the problem thoroughly. So what does it mean to understand a problem? There's a few fundamental pillars to this. First, you have to understand what the problem is actually asking for. This means that you have a clear idea of how to get from input to output. Second, you should strive to identify at least 2 approaches to a problem. One should be a brute force naive approach, and the other should be a more optimal approach of some sort. Third, you want to be able to discuss the trade-offs between each approach. This means using big O notation to talk about the space and time complexity. Now, if you've never heard of space and time complexity, subscribe to my channel and I'm going to cover this topic in depth in another video. Fourth, you want to be able to actually implement the algorithm from scratch and talk through each line as you do it. Now, in order to submit a question on LeetCode, it's definitely not necessary that you understand the problem to this depth. This can all exist inside of your head. You can submit the solution on LeetCode, whether you write this out or not. But I urge you to get this thought process out, either by typing it out or talking it out loud. Communicating your approach to the problem will force you to understand everything far more than if you just kept it inside of your head. Another thing to keep in mind is that the communication aspect of interviews is a key point on the grading rubric, so it's in your best interest to actually practice this. But by far, the main reason why a thorough understanding of problems is so important is that it increases your likelihood of being able to recognize the pattern for other problems. And this pattern recognition is the differentiating skill between someone who's able to succeed in most of the interviews that they face versus someone who crumbles under the pressure of not knowing how to navigate a problem. So thing number 4 that I did is to do mock interviews. Generally speaking, the more mock interviews you do, the better. And this is because the verbal communication aspect of an interview is for sure a bit of a performance. And it's entirely reasonable to assume that if you're a seasoned coder with experience in data structures and algorithms, you'll be fine in the interview process. But it's also reasonable to assume that that person would have done much better had they practiced with mock interviews. Remember that these coding interviews are an imperfect proxy to get certain signals about you. I can virtually guarantee that if your communication aspect is abysmal across all 5 interviews, your chances of landing an offer is going to be very low. And so when you do mock interviews, here are the things that you're going to want to focus on. First, ask clarifying questions. Second, say out loud all of the problem constraints that you can think of. Third, discuss with the interviewer each and every approach that you can think of. Fourth, check in with the interviewer when you're ready to move forward, saying something like, I think I'm going to implement this approach. How does this sound? Fifth, as you write out your code, you're going to want to verbally narrate it. That doesn't literally mean you have to recite word for word what you're writing on the board, like for let I equals 0, yada, yada, yada. But you could say something along the lines of, I'm going to write a for loop now, iterating from index 0 to the end of the array, ... and then proceed to actually write out the code. And finally, you're going to want to test your code by being the interpreter. What I mean by this is you're going to pick some inputs and the expected outputs for those inputs. And then you're going to start at the top of your code, leave comments to identify the program state, and work your way down line by line, updating comments as the program state changes. This makes it easier for your interviewer to follow along with what you're doing. Now, the fifth thing that I did to prepare is to get rest and exercise. This is more common sense advice, but it's worth mentioning because it can have a big impact. Preferably, interview prep is not something you should always feel like you have to grind through. A little bit each day, consistently, for a long period of time is the best way to go. And the best way to stay committed is to have a sane schedule, a sane lifestyle, and a good degree of balance to help you sustain the effort. This means staying well rested. I personally avoided sacrificing sleep for my studying, and instead I focused on cutting other things out, like time I spent with friends, going out to dinner, or entertainment. You probably know what you can cut out from your own schedule to make time for this. There's also tons of research on the topic of exercise and brain performance. The basic takeaway is that regular exercise will help a ton with your confidence. And it turns out that higher confidence is correlated with increased problem-solving ability. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that exercise will make up for studying, but exercising and having a daily practice that orients you in discipline will positively influence your study habits. The compounding effect of this on a daily basis can have a big impact on your outcomes. And if your interview is coming up anytime soon, then I recommend actually exercising on the day of the interview. I personally went running for about 45 minutes on the day of the interview, bright and early. I did it because I knew that it was going to be a big confidence booster going in. You want to go into the interviews feeling like you're at your best. The way that I see it is no amount of last-minute studying is actually going to increase your chances of solving problems that you've never seen before. The interviews are not really about passing a test, but to parse out specific characteristics about you. So you'll be far better off having exercised, having slept well, and feeling confident and feeling well going into the interview. Okay, so that's how I prepared for my Google coding interview. I hope you found this information helpful. If you enjoyed this video, give me a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this on working in tech as a programmer. I also have a newsletter dedicated for people who are interested in transitioning careers into software development. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Okay, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.